Oh, there we go. All right, so there's three main types of pretreatment standards. There's the general and specific prohibitions, and those are listed in 403. And there are local limits that POTWs that they yet to develop based on their treatment capacity and technology of their plant. And then the categorical standards, which are published by EPA. So Chuck already talked about, did you talk about general prohibitions? In general, you know, you can't pass through and it cause interference to plant. So, you know, here's some beautiful pictures. And wow, let me see, you know, beautiful green water coming out of a effluent discharge pipe from POTW. So, like, this is obvious sign of possible pass-through fontines. And then other specific prohibitions include, you know, fire explosion, corrosive damage, like Chuck mentioned. We'll go through this really quick. There's some really beautiful pictures of obstruction, you know, grease and sugars and all sorts of nastiness.
The one on the left is Pizza Hut.
That's a Pizza Hut? Reasons why I don't eat at Pizza Hut. Imagine your arteries. So these are the specific prohibitions that are in the federal regs and the Pretreat regs. Just heat, you know, any heat amounts that could inhibit the biological activities at your plant, oils in amounts that could cause interference or pass-through. POTWs, if they decide to accept haul waste, they should have a designated spot. You can't just be, oh, just go to a manhole, pop it, and discharge it there. They should designate a discharge point. And POTWs are also required to develop local limits so they can protect their plant, which is, you know, money to them. And so the local limits should be developed in order to protect their plant, their collection system, personnel. So, you know, if personnel don't get overcome by fumes at the plant or in the collection system, and ensure that sludge can be disposed of. So local limits are pretreatment standards. So if a POTW has developed local limits that are technically based, they are considered pretreatment standards. And they can be expressed as pollutant-specific limits. Narrative prohibitions, like we just saw previously, they can be BMPs, best management plans, such as for restaurants, you must scrape all the grease into a garbage bin before washing, like with BMPs. Case-by-case discharge limits, like, you know, California, they can have saltwater pools. So a limit could be, our requirement would be, you know, in order to discharge a saltwater pool, you have to get a permit from the city and whatnot. So those are local limits. Like I said before, local limits have to be technically based, and they have to implement the prohibitions, the general and specific prohibitions listed in 403.5A and B. They have to be developed for each pollutant of concern. So if, like, a pollutant of concern could be pollutants that are limited by a POTW's NPDES permit, treatment capacity, pollutants that are known to be discharged from their IUs, pollutants that can cause worker health and safety issues, pollutants that are regulated by 503 sludge requirements. So when implementing local limits, the POTW has to decide how they're going to allocate these limits, and we'll talk about that later. Limits are applied, local limits are applied at end of pipe. And end of pipe is where the discharger's pipe is connected to the POTW's collection system. That's end of pipe. And categorical limits are end of process. So it's at the end of the categorical process. So there could be treatment. If there's treatment, then it's immediately after that treatment. So there's a difference in compliance points. Local limits are end of pipe. Categorical limits are end of process. And then POTWs have to have the legal authority established in their ordinance or local regulations to establish local limits. And then they apply those local limits via control mechanisms such as permits. EPA has a local limits development guidance manual, and that can be found on this site. And actually several EPA regions have developed spreadsheets where POTWs can input their data, so it generates limits for them. The one we like to use in general, is that region?
5.
5. It's an Excel spreadsheet. They have tables, and it's really interesting. It's easy, and you can find them by Googling them or going to the EPA region sites. You can find them there.
Yeah, and we use it for California because Keith liked it. You know, he said of all the ones that were out there, he liked Region 5 and just so
And it's easy to amend.
Instruct it up to
It's,
you.
you know, and it's an Excel spreadsheet, so you can amend it easily, and you can add rows, and the formulas all check out, because we've used it and we've checked it out, so it all works well. Here's some just general concepts and terms that we use a lot when we're talking about local limits. We'll define these in the next couple of slides. So an important term is the maximum allowable headworks loading. That is the maximum amount of pollutants that can be discharged to a POTW, and that won't cause pass-through interference. So when you're looking at local limits, you have to calculate the allowable headworks loadings for many parameters, such as the allowable headworks loading based on MPDS permit limit requirements, based on sludge requirements, and then based on treatment plant inhibition. And then the maximum allowable headworks loading would be the smallest value of all of the allowable headworks loading. So then in this case, it was based on treatment inhibition. And then once you have the MAHL, the maximum allowable headworks loading, you have to develop, or the POTWs have to develop, what is the allowable loadings they distribute to their industrial users. We call that the MAIL, which is the maximum allowable industrial loading. So basically the MAIL is the, wrong button. The maximum allowable headworks loading that we found in the other slide, and we take out the uncontrolled sources, such as domestic, that we don't control the residents, take that out, and whatever, and then any safety factors that POTWs may want to set aside for growth, for just whatever, for that rainy day thing, and the remainder is the MAIL, what's allowed to be distributed for their industrial or non-domestic sources. So a control source is anyone that you can permit, such as any non-domestic users, commercial or institutional users, hospitals, newspapers, wherever, smaller entities, and if they have waste haulers would be considered a controlled source. And uncontrolled sources, you know, I&I, you can't really control I&I. Treatment chemicals that are added to the sewer just for maintenance, you know, that's within a POTW's entity and stuff like that. And drinking water issues, those are typically uncontrolled sources. You can't control them. So steps that a POTW would have to go through to determine local limits is they first have to determine which pollutants are of concern to them. Then they have to collect and analyze the data. And they have to do math, which they hate to do, to calculate the MAHL. Then they designate and implement local limits and address collection systems and concerns. So as the approval authority, when a POTW wants to develop local limits, they may call you and say, so what's adequate sampling to you? You know, they don't want to spend all this money on sampling, so you know, it might behoove you to sit down with them and discuss, you know, what's adequate sampling. You know, they should definitely sample the influent, the effluent, and maybe in between their treatment processes to get removal efficiencies. And they would have, you know, you could say, well, you should also go sample your domestic source, which is your uncontrollable sources. And EPA, in the EPA's guidance manual on developing local limits, there is a table, a general rule of thumb of how much sampling should be done. So, you know, if you don't know anything about sampling or for local limits, pick up that guidance manual and, you know, walk through it with your POTWs. It's really helpful. Because the worst thing is they do all the sampling and you're trying to review the data and you're like, you don't have enough. You know, you don't have enough data here to generate applicable or adequate local limits, and then they have to start that process over again. So talk to your POTWs, be there with them, and, you know, and work together, which is really important. Yes. The pollutants of concern, so what you look at is, you know, the pollutants that are limited by their MPDS permit. You know, like some MPDS permits have a slew of metals that the POTW has to comply with, so those obviously would be pollutants of concern. EPA has 15 general, like, pollutants of concern that is, you know, in general, and then sludge pollutants, the metals and sludge. Pollutants that are discharged by their industrial users. I like to see pollutants of concern in the initial front, anything that was detected in the influent. any toxic organics that were detected in the influent. I mean, they could fall out later during your assessment because, you know, it gets volatilized or whatever and it's not really a pollutant concern. But I like to see where that's coming from. Is it coming from a domestic source or is it actually coming from an industry that they just didn't know was discharging organics? So when I do local limits evaluations or when I'm running local limits, I'll have a huge initial list of pollutants of concern. It's really, really long. And then I start eliminating by reviewing sampling data. So sampling data shows that my, you know, carbon test was just a hit on one day in the influent, and then the rest of my sampling, there were non-detects. So that was probably just the weird glitch, and I'll disregard that. So that's how you would start. You just sort of narrow it down.
It's kind of equivalent to doing a reasonable potential analysis, but instead of just looking at effluent, you're looking at a whole bunch of different potential impacts. Like if they could potentially inhibit treatment processes, or violate effluent limits, or violate sludge requirements.
But for the reasonable potential analysis, we basically target the priority pollutants. So it's
right. So this is a larger, this is a larger list. It would include all of the priority pollutants plus other pollutants.
So when you actually look at their data, you look at all of your C's, PMAs, and the macros, and so is there because sometimes I'm confused, like the pesticides, they don't really fall into the PMA category. So is there
Well, there are some that are priority pollutants.
The PCBs are priority pollutants.
Yeah.
Some of the PCBs are.
right? But when you say, for example, you go to the industry, you want to see what kind of possible pollutants in the effluent, for example, so you want to run some kind of scan.
Well, if you're if you're a categorical industry, they have to submit a BMR to you, which is a baseline monitoring report. So in that report, usually there's the priority pollutant list, and they have to mark off present, suspect present, not present, or suspect non-present. So you can look at that list and get a snapshot of what may or may not be there. And then if they're like a 433 metal finishing facility, they're required to either sample for TTOs, total toxic organics, or certify that they don't have any. So that's where you can kind of get an idea of what an IU is discharging to you. But as a POTW, they're required to do a full scan of their influent and effluent for, based on their PDS permit requirements. So the POTW can look at that and say, well, these slew of pollutants have always been non-detect in the influent, effluent, so we're going to disregard those as possible pollutants of concern because we've never detected them, right? But as the approval authority, I'm going to look at that too, but I'm also going to look at the sampling that you submitted for the local limits. So if there was a hit for organic chemical that they eliminated, but I know that a certain IU in their service region has that, I would ask them to reincorporate that and do a little bit more sampling. So it all depends. It's a moving thing. It's not the same for every POTW, obviously. Okay. So this is the type of samples the POTW should be collecting, and as the approval authority, you should review and see if they are collecting this type of data. We like to see actual data taken from that service region. Some POTWs, in order to save money, will use collection data, domestic background from other cities. Now, is that truly reflective of what is being discharged to POTW? Maybe, I don't know, but we like to see actual data from their own service area. And I had, well, that's another slide. And then, they obviously have data from their industrial users. They have sludge data that's required by their NPDES permit. So I would look over those and make sure they're adequate. If you know that their NPDES plant recently had an upgrade to their plant within the last 6 months, but they're submitting influent effluent data from prior to that, you know that their removal efficiencies are probably not appropriate. So just keep those things in mind when you're reviewing local limits submitted by POTWs. Were there upgrades to the plant? Is the effluent data they submitted before the improvements or after improvements, and how applicable are they? more about analyzing data. Here's more data they should be submitting to you for review if they're submitting their local limits. And then the POTW is supposed to calculate their maximum allowable headworks loading. So they have to calculate the removal efficiencies and the allowable headworks loadings for each of the criterion. Here's an example of how to do math. So these are the knowns. We have all these knowns, and it's just simply plugging in and calculating. For some reason, people get really scared at looking at these formulas. I don't know why POTWs are. It's just really simple math. It's multiplication and division, but it's simple. You plug in all the knowns, and for our example, we have an allowable headworks loading based on an MPDS permit requirement for this pollutant at 27 pounds per day. And then we do it again for inhibition to the plant. So we plug in all the knowns again. And based on secondary inhibition, the POTW can accept 490 pounds for this pollutant. And then we do it again for sludge. Based on sludge requirements, we calculate a 70 pound per day allowable loading, and then we compare all three numbers. And the most stringent one is the MAHL, maximum allowable headworks loading. So as the approval authority, you have to check your math. Don't assume they did their math right. Yes?
Sometimes in the NPDS permits, there's seasonal effluent limitations.
Okay.
Can you incorporate those in local limits, like
Yep.
seasonal?
Yeah, so if the seasonal is much more stringent, and the POTW should just apply that as their limiting factor. And so they're more stringent. Or if they want to do a tiered permit or tiered limits, they're like, for the dry season, for zinc, this would be your limit, and then for the wet season, define the months, we would use this number. They can do that, but they have to spell it out into their permit. But if they don't want the tier permitting, tier limit type of thing, they should choose the most stringent limiting limit in their NPDS and plug it into those formulas. And so, you know, I've had like consultants that work for POTWs that submit these beautiful, beautiful, you know, colored documents, but their math is all wrong. Because, you know, they just plug into the spreadsheet. You know, who knows who had contact with that spreadsheet, and instead of a multiplication sign, they divided, and all their numbers are wrong. And I always like to see the formulas that they use. Like, when you submit your document to me, I want to see what formulas you use, because I want to be able to reproduce the numbers that the POTW has done. And if I can't reproduce it, and I can't figure it out, I send it back and say, I can't approve it, because I can't duplicate your numbers. And you have to explain to me what you've done. So I would suggest that they, you know, include their formulas. The spreadsheets, you know, usually it's just numbers. And you're like, I don't know what operations are happening between cells.
I have just one other question
Yes.
too. Sorry, I was on a slide before, but you had, maybe you mentioned it and I missed it, but one of the a slide you had collected and analyzed data, you have two things for data. One says treatment plant's primary effluent, and then the second one says treatment plant's effluent.
Okay,
What do you mean by that?
Primary effluent would be the effluent following their primary
Primary
treatment.
process, okay.
Right, so
That's
we
what I
can
just wanted
see
to make sure.
removal efficiencies.
Okay, thank you.
In between processes. And so once we decide what the MAHL, the maximum allowable headworks loading, the POTW takes away from that the uncontrolled portion. So we take some of that pie out and reserve it. And now they have to decide how they're gonna allocate what's left over to their industrial users. And there's many different methods of allocating the MAIL. They can do it based on contributory flow, they can do it based on mass proportion, or the most simple and the most widely used is a uniform concentration based. And here's just, you know, formulas for calculating limits based on those allocation methods. So in a local limit submission submitted to you guys, they should spell out how they're going to allocate. And obviously, if they're gonna use a non-traditional, if they're not gonna use a uniform concentration base, they should say, oh, we're gonna use IU contributory flow. And in that document they submit to you, they should include all the flow data from their IUs. And you have to be able to reproduce the numbers that they are proposing. But all of these formulas are in the EPA guidance manual for local limits. And I just went through like simple exercise of showing, how to use math. And this was developed for POTWs that are afraid of math, but it's just plugging in the knowns that we have and developing numbers. And so once the POTW has developed a limit, it's just a number to them. How are they going to apply that limit? Is that limit a daily maximum? Is that an instantaneous maximum? Is that a monthly average? What is it? They have to tell you that in their submission. Otherwise, you don't know, because they could be applying their local limits as annual averages. There is a POTW that has an annual average local limit, and that is, in all likelihood, not stringent enough, because local limits are usually based on MPDS limits, and there are daily and monthly averages. So how are you going to translate that into a month and yearly average local limit and be protective of what you're supposed to be protecting, prevention of interference and pass-through? So make sure they tell you in their submission how they're going to apply their local limits. They can always go more stringent. When we talked about that, these are just the general and specific prohibitions. And here's more guidance to review if you need more guidance on worker health and safety and oil and grease issues, just resources for you. And I think, I have one funny story. So I was reviewing local limits, and a POTW was going to develop local limits for EC, electrical conductivity. They had a limit. And so there is no EPA federal formula to develop a limit for EC. And so I was wondering how he developed this number, because I'm like, if you figured it out, did you do a correlation between EC and TDS, and kind of what did you do? Because I don't want to reinvent the wheel. He goes, oh, EPA has formulas. We use, which formula did they use? They use this formula and just plugged it in. I'm like, but the units don't work. They're like, what do you mean units don't work? It's just a number. We just plug the number straight in, and voila, we have pounds per day of EC. I'm like, pounds per day of EC. So we had to go through a unit exercise. Yes.
Could you do like some sort of a corollary, like a TDS? If they
That's why I thought he did. I thought maybe he did EC and TDS sampling and did a correlation. No, he said, no, it's a number in the MPDS permit. I just plugged it into this formula. See, that said C MPDS, that's where I plugged it in, and I have pounds of EC.
Did he also have pounds per day of pH?
No, he didn't do that.
24-hour composite sample.
Yeah, so you have to watch out for that. Then it's just, no, you can't do that. Yes?
Do the local limits, do they account for the variability of the industrial facility?
It does. You have safety factors, and as a POTW, you have sampling of your SIUs, and you have SWRCB, by the way. So the POTWs have to look at that, and you look at that, and in the reality of things, if you do uniform concentration, not all of your SIUs, or not all of the POTW SIUs, are going to be discharging at that maximum limit all the time. So you do have safety factors built in, but you just have to be careful. Like if a POTW decides to have no safety factor, a big old 0, that's not okay with me. You gotta be protective of your plant. And if they're gonna go do something less stringent and over allocate, that's not okay either.
And you can allocate different ways to take into account variances from particular industries.
But you just can't over allocate.
Yeah.
Like the flow, the contributor flow. Like if Chuck has a bigger facility than I do, and he has chromium issues, but I don't, the POTW is like, since you don't have chromium, we'll give your allocation to Chuck. But they need to keep track of what they're allocating. If they're gonna allocate different things to different people, and as long as the allocations add up less than the MAIL that they calculated, that's fine, but they have to have appropriate methods for tracking that. A spreadsheet, whatever, and if it's not outlined in their submission, I would say, come back and tell me how you're gonna track it. Who's gonna be tracking it?
Yeah, probably over a decade ago, EPA started farming with the idea of effluent trading, like with allocation to directly charges receiving streams, municipalities and industry. And what ended up happening as a result of that is people were taking that a step further, and you had industry within a city trading
Among
limits.
themselves.
Yeah, among themselves without involving the city whatsoever, and saying, I'm not gonna discharge you nickel so you can have my nickel. And then they were getting NOV from the city because they were violating the permit limit. And so there had to be an education process that says that, the same concept applies, but we call it reallocating the local limits. And the city, whose control authority, is actually one that dictates how that's done and whether or not it's done. But
I was also going to mention that there's also a federal regulatory requirement for IUs to notify the POTW of change discharges. So if there is variability outside of what they had initially submitted as part of their applications for permits, they need to notify the POTW, and they can change their local limits as a result if they need to.
Any other questions? You have one?
Yeah, what's the permitting cycle? How can they have to relook at the allocations every time?
The local limits, technically, is supposed to be re-evaluated once every 5 years in conjunction with the NPDS permit cycle. So typically, it's 180 days after your NPDS permit has been issued. They need to re-evaluate to determine whether or not the current local limits are going to be protective of, prevention of interference and passage.
yeah, and that's not necessarily going through this detailed calculation as much as it is comparing the loadings from industries that come in versus, at the influence of the plant and how close you are on reaching capacity of the plant and complying with your NPDS permit.
Right, and in the EPA local limits guidance manual, there is a little rule of thumb type of thing, like if you are approaching 60% of your MAIL, or is it 60 or 80%?
80.
Is it 80%? You should likely reevaluate that local limit for that pollution. Right, so there is a little rule of thumb thing in the guidance manual.
Does that also cover applicable safety factors? Like how you would estimate what a good safety factor should be? It seems like that would come into play with that.
The safety factor, or there's a safety factor and a growth factor, and those are all POTW dependent. Like if you're a POTW and you know that you're not going to be growing because your plant is at capacity and you just can't have any more, so I would say growth factor of 0 because you don't expect any more growth. So maybe increase it on the safety factor side. I like to see a range from like 10 to 30.
Okay, that's what I was wondering.
Yeah, and typically, if you calculate limits, say you use a 25% safety factor, and you come up with the numbers, and you go back and look at historical data from industries, and you see that half your industry is going to be violating that number, then you may want to go back and reevaluate that safety factor. There's a lot of safety actually built into it, and sometimes depending on what Ishii referred to, either a city's going, we don't want any more industry, or we strictly want to be residential. But we've had cities that, because of the impact from industries on their wastewater plant and receiving stream, where we've issued moratoriums that said, thou shall not allow any more metal-bearing waste streams into your collection system. And so then they know their growth factor is not going to be very high because we're not, the state's not going to let them have any more.